It began in May of 1946, a time when America was struggling to transform itself from a wartime powerhouse into a peaceful nation. The Second World War had ended less than a year earlier, yet the wounds it left on the economy, society, and the political system were still raw. Soldiers returned home to a country that had promised them opportunity but faced shortages of housing, employment, and basic goods. Factories and industries attempted to convert from military to civilian production, but logistical bottlenecks slowed the process. The American public, weary from years of sacrifice, demanded stability, order, and a return to normalcy. Yet beneath this fragile calm, a storm was brewing, a storm that would test the resolve, authority, and very soul of the presidency itself. Harry S. Truman, the 33rd President of the United States, had assumed office under circumstances few men could have handled. Following the death of Franklin D. Roosevelt in April 1945, Truman found himself thrust into leadership during one of the most critical periods in American history. The war in Europe was over, the Pacific Campaign had ended with the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the United States faced the daunting task of transitioning from wartime austerity to post-war prosperity. Truman's every decision was under scrutiny, his every action analyzed by Congress, the press, and the American people. But even for a man seasoned by politics, the events of May 1946 would push him to the edge of his endurance and test the limits of presidential power.
It all began with a labor dispute that seemed, at first glance, trivial compared to the global crises Truman had faced. The railroad unions, which had been crucial to the war effort, had grown increasingly frustrated by stagnant wages, long hours, and difficult working conditions. Having maintained strict wage controls during the war, the government and railroad companies were unprepared for the intensity of post-war demands. Negotiations had begun months earlier, but talks stalled repeatedly. On May 23, 1946, these frustrations reached a breaking point. 400,000 railroad workers walked off the job, paralyzing the nation's transportation system. Trains that carried coal, food, mail, and military supplies ground to a halt. Within hours, ports clogged with cargo. Hospitals warned of potential shortages of essential materials, and factories dependent on railroad transport faced shutdowns. The economy teetered on the edge of chaos. The strike was not merely a labor dispute, it was a full-scale national crisis. The trains were the lifeblood of the country. Their stoppage threatened to cripple the nation's ability to function. Truman quickly recognized the magnitude of the situation.
As he studied reports from the Department of Labor and the War Department, he realized that this strike could destabilize not just the economy, but the American government itself. Millions of Americans depended on railroads for survival, and Congress had shown little inclination to act decisively. Truman had tried diplomacy, compromise, and public appeals, but nothing worked. The unions remained defiant, and the companies refused to yield. The standoff escalated with every hour. By the evening of May 24th, the situation had reached a tipping point. Truman convened a meeting with his closest advisors in the Oval Office, a small, dimly lit room filled with tension, the weight of the nation pressing down on every person present. The mood was somber, almost fearful. Discussions about taking extraordinary executive action, including federal seizure of the railroads and mandatory arbitration, dominated the conversation. Every option carried immense risk. Congress could block legislation. Union leaders might resist enforcement. The public might turn against the administration. Every aide present understood that the coming hours could define Truman's presidency and, potentially, the future of the country.
It was in this atmosphere of crisis that Truman made a statement that would shock those around him. He said, calmly but firmly, "If Congress will not support me tomorrow, I will resign the presidency." The room fell silent. The aides, many of whom had served in Roosevelt's administration and were no strangers to political drama, were taken aback. Truman, usually a man of pragmatic decisiveness, had now threatened the unthinkable: to walk away from the highest office in the land in the midst of a national emergency. But Truman was not bluffing. His exhaustion, frustration, and profound sense of duty converged to produce a resolve that few could comprehend. If the government could not act to save the country from paralysis, he would step aside. He did not leave his threat as mere words. Truman retired to his private study and took pen to paper, drafting a formal resignation letter. On official White House stationery, he typed a concise and pointed message. Should Congress fail to enact emergency railroad legislation by the following day, he would resign immediately and the office would pass to the next in line. Every signature, every word reflected the gravity of the moment. Truman's aides, knowing the stakes, pleaded with him to reconsider. They reminded him of the constitutional crisis that would follow, the uncertainty of succession, and the chaos that might ensue. But Truman remained resolute.
As the night deepened, the tension in Washington was mirrored across the country. The public, largely unaware of the drama unfolding in the White House, experienced the tangible effects of the strike. Cities faced shortages of coal and essential goods. Hospitals scrambled to secure oxygen and other vital supplies. Factories threatened to close. America was, in effect, frozen in place. Newspapers reported the crisis in stark terms, framing it as the most severe domestic challenge since the end of World War II. Political commentators speculated about Truman's options, though none had any inkling that the president might resign. Behind the headlines and editorials, the real story, the one in which the fate of the nation rested on a single desk in the Oval Office, remained hidden. The next morning, Truman prepared to confront Congress. In a speech that would resonate with unprecedented force, he outlined the crisis with stark clarity. He described the strike as a threat not just to commerce, but to national security and public welfare. Every word was deliberate, every pause calculated to convey urgency without panic. He warned that failure to act could leave the nation paralyzed, that the federal government might be compelled to intervene with extraordinary measures. Though he did not reveal the resignation letter, the intensity of his address suggested the seriousness of his resolve. It was an unspoken ultimatum, a signal that the president would go to extraordinary lengths to protect the nation, even if it meant stepping aside.
In response to Truman's speech, the railroad unions, recognizing the president's determination and the potential consequences of continued defiance, began to reconsider their position. Behind closed doors, negotiations accelerated. By the afternoon, reports arrived that union leaders were prepared to return to the bargaining table and accept terms that would end the strike. The nation's transportation system would resume operation. The immediate crisis had been averted. The trains moved once more, the ports cleared, and the factories resumed production. The country breathed a collective sigh of relief. Yet the significance of that night extended far beyond the immediate resolution of the strike. Truman's near resignation revealed the immense pressures and responsibilities that weighed upon the presidency. It demonstrated the delicate balance between executive authority and legislative support, the interplay between political risk and national necessity, and the profound isolation a president can experience when the survival of the government itself is at stake. Historians examining this episode note that Truman's willingness to threaten resignation underscored his understanding that the office he held was not a reward but a responsibility, a burden that could not be abdicated lightly.
Moreover, the episode highlights the complexity of post-war America. The nation had emerged victorious from a global conflict, yet domestic instability threatened to undermine that achievement. The railroad strike, seemingly mundane compared to the battles of Europe and the Pacific, became a crucible for leadership. testing the limits of presidential authority, the responsiveness of Congress, and the resilience of American institutions. Truman's actions that night exemplify the extraordinary measures leaders sometimes contemplate when faced with existential challenges, and they remind us that history is often shaped not by battles won or treaties signed, but by moments of personal courage and decisive action behind closed doors. The resignation letter ultimately was placed back in Truman's desk, never to be submitted. Its presence, however, served as a silent witness to the president's resolve and the precariousness of governance. The aides who knew of its existence carried with them a secret that would remain untold for decades, a hidden narrative of a night when the fate of the American government balanced on a single decision. The story itself of tension, uncertainty, and near catastrophe is a testament to the unpredictable and often unseen forces that shape history.
This was a night of high drama, political suspense, and human vulnerability. It was a night when a president stared into the abyss of potential governmental collapse and chose, ultimately, to stay and confront the storm. It was a night when the United States came dangerously close to witnessing an unprecedented constitutional crisis. And it was a night that, had events taken a slightly different turn, might have rewritten the history of the post-war world entirely. In the decades since, historians have pieced together accounts from aides, congressional records, and newspaper archives to reconstruct the sequence of events. The consensus is clear. The night of Truman's near resignation was not merely an anecdote, but a pivotal episode, a defining moment in the exercise of executive power, and a dramatic illustration of the human element at the heart of governance. It is a story of tension, courage, and the extraordinary pressures faced by those entrusted with leadership. And it is a story that, though hidden from public view for decades, deserves to be remembered for its sheer drama, historical importance, and the remarkable character it reveals in a man who would become one of America's most consequential presidents. History often remembers the outcomes, laws passed, battles won, presidents re-elected, but the hidden nights, the private decisions, and the near catastrophes offer the richest, most compelling tales. The night Truman nearly resigned is one such tale, a moment of suspense, uncertainty, and drama so intense that it rivals the most dramatic events of wartime. The trains eventually ran, the government survived, and the resignation letter, silent and secret, remained a symbol of the extraordinary pressures faced by those at the pinnacle of power.
It is in these hidden moments, away from cameras and headlines, that history's tension reaches its peak. The night Harry Truman almost walked away from the presidency reminds us that even in peacetime, leadership demands courage, resolve, and a willingness to confront crises that may seem insurmountable. It reminds us that the stability of nations can hinge not only on armies and laws, but on the decisions of a single individual and the resolve to act decisively when the stakes could not be higher. The story of Truman's near resignation is more than a footnote. It is a narrative filled with suspense, tension, and human drama. It encapsulates the delicate balance of power, the unpredictability of governance, and the immense responsibility inherent in the office of the president. For historians, students, and enthusiasts of political drama alike, it stands as one of the most compelling and underexplored episodes in 20th century American history. It is a tale that demonstrates vividly and memorably how the course of a nation can pivot on a single night, a single decision, and a single piece of paper. The night Harry Truman almost resigned remains a hidden jewel of American history. It reminds us that even in a world seemingly defined by events of global scale, the private deliberations, fears, and decisive actions of one individual can shape the destiny of millions. It is a story of suspense, consequence, and the relentless demands of leadership,
a story that is as gripping today as it was over 70 years ago.